Okay, class. Today we're going to be talking about macroeconomic goals and some a little bit more bigger picture things. So, there's this thing called the internal balance, and it describes macroeconomic goals of producing at potential output, or what's called full employment, and of having price stability, or low inflation. Non-sustainable use of resources, overemployment, tends to increase prices. Underemployment tends to decrease prices. So aggregate demand and output are volatile, which create volatile prices. Price level movements reduce the economy's efficiency by making the real level of the monetary unit less certain. So external balance is achieved when a current account is neither so deeply in deficit that the country may be unable to repay its foreign debts, nor so strongly in surplus that foreigners are put in that position. We have what's called the intertemporal budget constraint, which limits each country's spending over time to levels that it can repay with interest. So we have what's called the open economy trilemma. A country fixes its currency's exchange rate while allowing free international capital movements, gives up control over domestic monetary policy. A country that fixes its exchange rate can have control over domestic monetary policy if it restricts international financial flows so that interest parity need not hold. Or a country can allow international capital to flow freely and have control over domestic monetary policy if it allows the exchange rate to float. So it's impossible in theory for a country to achieve more than two items from the following list: exchange rate stability, monetary policy towards domestic goals, freedom of international capital movements. This is kind of a nice little chart that shows that. So, macroeconomic policy under the gold standard. This was from 1870 to 1914. After 1918, there were mechanisms that prevented flows of gold reserves from becoming too positive or too negative. Prices tended to adjust according to the amount of gold circulating in the economy, which had effects on the flows of goods and services. That's called the current account. Central banks influenced financial asset flows so that the non-reserve part of the financial account matched the current account. This was to reduce gold outflows or inflows. We have what's called the price specie flow mechanism. This is the adjustment of prices as gold flows in or out of a country. The inflow of gold inflates prices. An outflow of gold deflates prices. So the price specie flow mechanism of gold standard could automatically reduce current account surpluses and deficit, achieving a measure of external balance for all countries. We have what's called the rules of the game. So the selling of domestic assets to acquire money when gold exited the country as payments for imports. This decreased the money supply and increased interest rates, attracting financial inflows to match the current account deficit. This reduced or reversed gold outflows. The buying of domestic assets when gold enters the country as income from exports. This increased the money supply, decreased interest rates, reduced financial inflows to match the current account. This reversed or reduced gold inflows. Banks with decreasing gold reserves had strong incentive to practice the rules of the game. Banks with increasing gold reserves had weak incentive to practice the rule of the game. Gold did not earn interest. Domestic assets earned interest. In practice, increasing gold reserves seldom followed the rules. Banks that did this. Banks often sterilized gold flows, trying to prevent any effect on money supplies and prices. The gold standard's record for internal balance was really mixed. The US suffered from deflation, recessions, financial instability while they were trying to adhere to the gold standard. There was periods of inflation and lots of economic turmoil. The unemployment under the gold standard was also substantially higher than it was. So let's move on to the interwar years. Gold standard was stopped in 1914 due to war. After 1918, it was attempted again, and it existed from 1919 to 1933. The UK reinstated the gold standard from 1925 to 1931, but countries that adhered to the gold standard suffered most from reduced output and employment during the 1930s. So let's move on to the Bretton Woods system. This was from 1944 to 1973. 44 countries met and designed this system where a fixed exchange rate against the US dollar and a fixed dollar price of gold were established. They also established other institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and GATT, which was the predecessor of WTO. So the IMF, this was constructed to lend to countries with persistent balance of deficits. So loans were made from a fund paid for by members. So this is extra government organization. So you essentially had to pay a amount of money to be a part of the IMF, and that money was used to loan to other countries. Each country had a quota, which determined its contribution to the fund, and the maximum amount it could borrow. This was also usually contingent on your GDP. Large loans were made conditional. So if you needed a large loan, the IMF would help you design domestic policies. So, due to borrowing and occasional devaluations, the IMF gives countries enough flexibility to maintain an external balance, yet it allows them to maintain an internal balance and stable exchange rates. The volatility of exchange rates under the gold standard was viewed as a source of economic instability. So, in order to avoid sudden changes in financial account, countries often prevented flows of financial assets across countries. Yet they encouraged flows of goods and services. Under a system of fixed exchange rates, all countries but the US had ineffective monetary policies. Principal tool for internal balance was fiscal policy. Principal tools for external balance were borrowing from the IMF and restriction on asset flows. So here's some math. It's fairly self-explanatory. So we have what's called the four zones of economic discomfort. We have overemployment, underemployment, and then we have over and underemployment with either current account deficits or current account surpluses. So we have some policies for internal external balance. In general, fiscal policy cannot attain both internal and external balance at the same time. A devaluation can attain this, though. Under Bretton Woods, fiscal policy was the main force that they tried to achieve internal balance. This was because of political reasons. So we have some problems under Bretton Woods. It collapsed kind of during the 60s and 70s, primarily due to imbalances in the US economy. We had a surplus, and it became a deficit in 1971. We had large increases in government purchases. This increased demand and output, but it also increased prices. Rising prices and a growing money supply caused the US dollar to become overvalued in terms of gold and in terms of foreign currencies. Another problem was that as foreign economies grew, their need for international reserves to maintain fixed exchange rates grew as well. This rate of growth was faster than the growth of gold reserves. So new discoveries of gold were growing slowly. So holding dollar denominated assets was the alternative. And at some point, dollar denominated assets held by foreign central banks would be greater than the amount of gold held by the Federal Reserve. As a result, the Federal Reserve was running out of gold. So the US, for political reasons, was not willing to reduce government purchases or increase taxes significantly, and it didn't reduce the money supply either. These policies would have prevented the collapse. So there's a perception that the US economy was experiencing a fundamental disequilibrium and that a devaluation would be necessary. First, speculation about a devaluation of the dollar caused investors to have a gold run. The Fed sold off large quantities of gold, but it closed the market afterwards. As a result of this gold run, it became Fed policy that private institutions and individuals were no longer allowed to redeem gold. So here's what the inflation rates looked like during the period of the Bretton Woods collapse. You could see as the 60s moved into the 70s, the inflation rates really grew. You can see in Britain that Britain went from an inflation rate of 6.5% to 9.7% between 1970 and 71. So the system officially collapsed in 1973. So we have what's called the floating exchange rate. This is monetary policy autonomy without a need to trade currency and markets. Central banks are free to influence domestic money supply, interest rates, and inflation. Central banks can more freely react to changes in aggregate demand, output, and in prices in order to achieve internal balance.